Hi, hey, welcome to the Cordial Catholic, a podcast for non-Catholics, new Catholics, and those looking to dig deeper into the Catholic Church. I'm Kay Albert Little. I'm an evangelical, non-denominational convert to Catholicism, and this podcast is born out of one particular idea. As I was looking into the deep roots of my non-denominational evangelical faith, into the history of the Church, I inevitably ran into the Catholic faith, the Catholic Church. And what I began to realize is that almost everything I knew about Catholicism was wrong. It was based on rumors and misunderstandings and misinformation. Well, this podcast serves to try and fill in those gaps. The gaps between what you think Catholics believe and what we actually do. I am joined every week by influential Catholic thinkers to talk about real Catholic topics from the heart of the Catholic Church. No misinformation here. And this week, I am joined by JonMarc Grodi from the Coming Home Network International, a good friend of mine, to talk about Prudence, the Pachamama, and a primer on the Cardinal Virtues. If you are a Vatican aficionado, a Vatican insider, if you follow church news, you may have heard of this Pachamama drama, as I've been cleverly calling it. It did serve, I suppose, over the last month or so as a catalyst for a lot of discussion about different things in the church. Things that are going wrong, things that are going right, people who are unhappy, people who are confused, and at the core of it, it's an opportunity for us to talk about the Cardinal Virtues. What does it mean to live as a Christian Catholic? To live with the standards that Christ calls us to in the face of problems in the church, in our own parish churches, in our lives, in the wider Christian world, and the wider world in general? What does it mean to be a Catholic? How do we live out that faith? And how do the Cardinal Virtues, what are the Cardinal Virtues? And how do they inform that thinking, that living, our actions? I dig deep with JonMarc into what the Cardinal Virtues are and how these should inform everything we do in our lives. It's a fantastic episode. This podcast is brought to you in part by my sponsor, Select International Tours. Have you considered how a pilgrimage might bolster the faith of your parish? Do you have a group of 10 people or more that might travel on a pilgrimage to the Holy Land, Guadalupe, the shrines of France, Italy, Ireland, Eastern Europe, or follow in the footsteps of Paul in Greece? If you do, then you should definitely reach out to Select International Tours. They have helped thousands of people organize pilgrimages for over 33 years, and they want to help you plan yours. Visit selectinternationaltours.com/cordial to learn more. That's selectinternationaltours.com/cordial. This podcast is also brought to you by my patrons at patreon.com/cordialcatholic, where even $1 or $2 a month goes a long way into helping me to expand the mission of evangelization that is this podcast. Every little bit helps, and I'm very grateful for your financial support. That's at patreon.com/cordialcatholic. And now, without any further ado, here's my fantastic episode, a primer on the Cardinal Virtues with JonMarc Grodi. Please listen and enjoy. Hey friend, and welcome back to the Cordial Catholic. My guest this week is JonMarc Grodi. JonMarc is a good friend of mine. He is the Chief Operating Officer for the Coming Home Network International, a regular guest on several shows, including Hands-On Apologetics with Gary Machuda, and Deep in Scripture, a podcast production from the Coming Home Network, where he appears alongside his father, Marcus. And I'm pleased to have him back here with me as a returning guest as well. Hello, JonMarc, and welcome back to the Cordial Catholic. So pleased to have you.
Thanks, Keith. I'm glad to be here.
All right, so I'm excited about this conversation with you, but I want to give listeners a little bit of a context about the genesis of this discussion and why I thought it would be such a good idea to have you on the show. It really started with the message that I sent you, a kind of cry for help a few weeks ago, and this was at the very end of the Amazon Synod taking place at the Vatican. Now, I don't want to get too far into the weeds here, but I think it's prudent to take a minute to explain, especially for our non-Catholic listeners, a little bit of the background here. So, we touched briefly on the idea of a synod actually in last week's episode with Father Blake Britton when we talked about Vatican II. But essentially, a synod is a meeting of bishops of the church, in this case from the Amazon region, to discuss certain topics or issues. So this particular synod was a bit controversial before it even started. There's a major shortage of priests in the Amazon region, and some of the proposals to alleviate that shortage raised some eyebrows, shall we say, in different parts of the church. And so when it began, it was kind of already controversial, I guess. And that controversy attached itself even further to these statues, which were seen in one of the opening ceremonies of the synod. Speculation kind of ran rampant. There's a great article from J.D. Flynn at the Catholic News Agency about the whole fiasco. But basically, these were seen as some kind of pagan idol. It wasn't really explained or refuted or clarified by anybody in any official capacity, and the whole thing kind of reached a tipping point when the statues were taken from a church and were thrown into the Tiber River. So this, JonMarc, is my catalyst for my original message to you, because what I saw unfolding on social media, especially, were Catholics rushing to judge, first of all, those in the Vatican for maybe idol worship, but then to applaud the act of the people who stole these statues and chucked them in the river as well. And I thought of you immediately because we've talked before about the virtues, about temperance and especially prudence, and what I saw surrounding these so-called Pachamama statues and so much of the tenor around the synod seemed to be a culture of the hot take, the immediate, unvarnished, kind of spontaneous reaction to something. And I thought, isn't there a place for virtue among these reactions? You know, I think we can, on one hand, have a really strong understanding and practice of our faith. We can be zealous, active disciples of Christ, but don't the cardinal virtues, by necessity, play some role in this? I mean, ultimately, isn't it the idea that if we're full on living in a hot take culture, this instant reaction culture, but we're Catholics, aren't we called to live maybe in a different way? And aren't the cardinal virtues meant to take some kind of place in this? And of course, all of this was wrapped up in my original cry for help to you. And I'm so glad you responded like Batman. And you're here to give us some insight, a response to my bat signal. So what can we make of the cardinal virtues in light of this kind of hot take culture, in light of these kind of acts of maybe heroics, but maybe sometimes our actions are lacking some of these virtues like temperance and prudence, and really taking a look at ourselves?
Right. Well, as you said, we don't want to get into the weeds. I couldn't get in the weeds if I tried here because I don't really know any of the details of something that's happened half a world away that only comes to me second, third, fourth, fifth hand. But with the virtues the cardinal virtues in particular describe what it looks like when a human person is operating at their highest capacity, that when they're flourishing, when their intellect and their will and their passions are operating well and in the right order. And, you bring up the hot take culture, the clickbait culture, the dumpster fire watching culture that we sort of have in our media today. And while I can't fully judge another person about what's going on in their particular soul in regards to their virtue, their relationship to the events going around them, I know from within myself that I'm in danger in terms of the virtues, in terms of my moral life when I'm around that sort of culture, because one of the main things that the cardinal virtues help us to recognize is that my reason, my knowledge of God and of the good, and my my choosing of that, that's to be at the helm. That's to be the operative aspect of me. And that is to order my passions toward the right ends. And whenever that gets flipped, whenever it's my excitement or my anger or my fear or my desire that's driving me, then the picture of the cardinal virtues has flipped upside down, and it's my passions, my inordinate passions that are driving me, and my reasons just coming along for the ride. But I'm getting ahead of ourselves. Let's go back a little bit and talk about, because, for me, the cardinal virtues, which I'm now rather intemperately obsessed with over the past year, are something, new to me in terms of my life. It's been the last couple of years that I've really started to study them. And the origin of that study came about a couple of years ago. In my men's group, a local men's group, we get together, a bunch of fathers and husbands, to talk about our vocations as Catholic men, and to discuss, how we're going to grow in those vocations, how we're trying to take that seriously, plant a flag, take territory for the Lord in our lives. And it is a good group, a lot of good discussions, many good books analyzed and dissected and discussed together. But after a time, we just noticed that while we were learning a lot, we were reading a lot of good books, talking a lot about good things, we were coming back to many of the same discussions about, practically speaking, I know all this, but I'm still doing the same dumb things. I'm still getting upset with my kids. I'm still impatient with people in the line. I'm still not, having the courage to sit down and pray with my wife, even though I know I ought to. All these things that we know that we should be doing, but we can't quite get into rhythm of doing them. And it got me interested in behavioral change, and how we, when we recognize we have bad habits, how we break those habits, how we develop good habits. And I was looking for sources on this, and of course, I'm thinking, well, the virtues, I don't know much about the virtues, but I've heard of them, and I get the concept of the virtue, which is that in doing the good over and over, you become the kind of person for whom doing the good is your delight. The more I do courageous things, the more I grow in courage. So it seemed like getting into the virtues was the right track. But I had a problem, Keith, because over the years, and I think this is just where the church is on this topic, that I think in the Middle Ages the medievals had a real science of virtue and vice. They had a real science of the human person, and it was very sophisticated. We've lost that, and I'm sure another good guest could probably analyze the reasons why. But throughout my life, the particular catechesis I've received, the people I've talked to, the homilies I've heard, I've received a very patchwork and inconsistent picture of what the virtues were, or what the corresponding vices were. And a couple examples of that, you pick up any book on the Catholic book or otherwise about the virtues, you're likely to find a rather haphazard collection of different sort of qualities. Then they all may be very good qualities, but I've picked up books before, and the collections of virtues just strike me as odd. It's like, yeah, we've got prudence in there and maybe courage, but then there's honesty and hospitality and integrity and et cetera, et cetera. All many good qualities, but there doesn't seem any rhyme or reason there, just endless lists. And of course, when you have a practical problem that you're looking for concrete answers to, endless lists are not helpful. They're just overwhelming. So there was something wrong, something I wasn't quite getting. Also, it seemed like I would encounter inconsistent lists. I think I remember back in campus ministry, we heard a talk, and it was talking about different root sins, and they struck me as an odd list, because one was talking about something like sensuality or vanity which seemed more surface level, and then the other one was pride, which is, we know, it's a much more deep and deeply rooted sort of sin. All this to say, it just struck me that there was some order here, there was some unifying factor, some ordering principle that I was missing. And long story short, I read a number of different books. But it was discovering Josef Pieper's The Four Cardinal Virtues, which, Pieper is he's a distinguished, I'm reading from the back of one of his books here because I don't have the stuff on hand. He's a distinguished 20th century Thomist philosopher, schooled in the Greek classics and in the writings of St. Thomas Aquinas. He studied philosophy, law, sociology, and taught for many years at the University of Munster, Germany. Josef Pieper, channeling St. Thomas Aquinas, really brought what I had been missing, which was this medieval scholastic science of virtue and vice, which is to say the science of human faculties and how they interact with grace and how they grow and how they develop and how they constitute the moral life and the growth in the moral life, insofar as we have something to do with it. The theological virtues describe God's grace working in us. We can only receive that. We can only ask for that. But insofar as we have something to do with it, we grow. We try to prepare the way of the Lord in our hearts. That is the path to the cardinal virtues.
I appreciate that you're reading the Josef Pieper's bio from the back of the book. Mm-hmm. That's fantastic.
Yeah,
that's great.
Yeah.
So, and of course, it comes back to Aquinas.
Yes,
so much good Catholic teaching does.
Yeah.
So then, what are the virtues as he gleans them from the great doctor of the Church?
Yeah. So again, most of the audience would probably know these, but the cardinal virtues are prudence, justice, fortitude, and temperance. And you may encounter them in different orders out there. And again, that was another aspect I found a little unsettling. But there is as I discovered in Pieper, there's actually a very specific order to these cardinal virtues. And cardinal, I believe, if I have it correctly, that's the Latin or the Greek for hinge. These are sort of the hinge virtues on which the moral life swings, it holds together. And so they describe this core set of virtues, and as we'll see later, many of the other virtues that might show up in these long lists are actually sub virtues. They're outgrowths or flourishing of these core essential virtues. But there's a reason that prudence is first, and this was one of the first big things that Pieper pointed out that was somewhat mind-blowing to me. So to back up just a moment, one of the things that he pointed out is that in the modern mind, the way the modern mind thinks of the cardinal virtues, and this was, again, another hang-up of mine, they almost seem to be at odds with one another sometimes. So, for instance, the way that the modern mind conceives of the virtue of prudence would seem to put it at odds with the virtue of courage. The modern mind thinks of the courageous man, the man who goes out and does an act of bravery, as the person who has ceased to be prudent. That the prudent person is the one who's hanging back, who is calculating, who's careful, who's cautious. And by contrast, the courageous person is the person who leaves prudence aside and finally decides to stand up. Pieper says that nothing could be further from the truth, according to the scholastics, according to Thomas Aquinas, to his picture of the human person. And I'll get to why in a moment. But another example, too, is, again, we can see some apparent opposition in the modern mind between courage and temperance. Is someone being courageous, or are they just being intemperate? In terms of, when we see an angry person, is that person really brave, or is that person just intemperate? They have a passion that's sort of out of control. How these work together, that was what I was really intrigued by. And again, the first main point that Pieper points out in his book that is sort of the key to all the cardinal virtues is that prudence is first. Let me read a quote here actually from Pieper illustrating this point. He says, this is in the first chapter of the book where he's begun to introduce this idea that, contrary to our modern thought, prudence is far more important, far more central, far more foundational, and really the linchpin of the cardinal virtues. He says this: to the contemporary mind, then, the concept of the good rather excludes than includes prudence. Modern man cannot conceive of a good act which might not be imprudent, nor of a bad act which might not be prudent. He will often call lies and cowardice prudent, truthfulness and courageous sacrifice imprudent. Classical Christian ethics, on the contrary, maintains that man can be prudent and good only simultaneously, that prudence is part and parcel of the definition of goodness, that there is no sort of justice and fortitude which runs counter to the virtue of prudence, and that the unjust man has been imprudent before and is imprudent at the moment that he is unjust. All virtue is necessarily prudent. Which, again, to the modern impression of what prudence is, that just sounds kind of wild. He goes on a little later. Prudence is the cause of the other virtues being virtues at all. For example, there may be a kind of instinctive governance of instinctual cravings, but only prudence transforms this instinctive governance into the virtue of temperance. Virtue is a perfected ability of man as a spiritual person, and justice, fortitude, and temperance as abilities of the whole man achieve their perfection only when they are founded upon prudence. That is to say, upon the perfected ability to make right decisions. Only by means of this perfected ability to make good choices are instinctive inclinations toward goodness exalted into the spiritual core of man's decisions, from which truly human acts arise. Prudence is needed if man is to carry through his impulses and instincts for right acting, if he is to purify his naturally good predispositions and make them into real virtue, that is, into the truly human mode of perfected ability. So what does this all mean? Let's put this in plain English for a second. Prudence is the virtue. Again, so backing up, what a virtue is this perfected ability of man. We practice something, we become more that kind of thing, the kind of person who delights in that sort of thing, who's able to do it well and easily. The virtue that prudence is this virtue of being awake, going through life intentional, making good decisions. And it's so key. It's the fact that prudence is first, the fact that it is the mother and mold, as he says later, of all moral virtue, is reflective of Aquinas' conception of the human person. We are rational beings made in God's image, and our reason, our knowledge of the truth, comes first before we guide it into making a decision. But we have to engage that aspect of our being first, and that takes practice. So there are two ways we can fail to be prudent. One way is to simply go through life asleep, perhaps somewhat intentionally asleep, to go through life not making decisions, not acting, but reacting. And so the first step in becoming prudent is waking up, seeking the truth, and making decisions about how I am to step forward. Another way to fail in prudence is to recognize the good and to refuse to do it, or to fail to do it. But it is that seeking the truth, that being open to the reality of things and trying to make a right decision accordingly, that is this virtue of prudence.
I think one way you put it that's pretty profound is the idea of going through life being awake. And that's absolutely a fantastic way of putting it. And I think about in my own life how often I am just, especially with young kids in tow, how often I'm just reacting to things rather than intentionally acting in a certain way, exercising that prudence, that right way of thinking. And of course we can't, and Pieper and Aquinas and the great scholastics wouldn't assume we can do these things by mere exercise of our own will, right? I mean, this is the whole idea of, hey, I need some grace infused into my life to help me be more prudent, right?
Right. Yeah. Well, and I see this is a good discussion. This another topic, which is the relationship between the cardinal virtues and the theological virtues. But one way to think of it is different forms of grace. One of the fundamental forms of grace that we experience is simply the natural grace that God gives us in our very nature. Before he gives us the actual grace in the moment to help us do something, he's given us the grace of making us the sort of beings that we are. And that grace is always already at work in us when we make the choice when we wake up to reality, when we seek the truth, and we try to start making good decisions. That grace is already at work in us. Even if we don't know the faith yet, even if we don't know God yet consciously, we're responding to that grace, and we're activating that grace that he's put in us in our very being. Now, again, as the cardinal virtues progress, as we try to grow in virtue, we come to know God, we continue to seek truth, then we come to a place of more consciously seeking and praying for and being open to that grace. But that grace is always already at work in us whenever we're activating our truly human faculties that are God-given.
So what comes next? Prudence is in charge. Hey, large and in charge. Prudence comes first.
Prudence comes first. As he says, prudence is the cause, root, mother, measure, precept, guide, and prototype of all ethical virtues. So prudence is open to reality, and one of the primary aspects of reality it is open to is justice. And justice is this framework of relationships that we live in. We are persons. We live in relationship with other persons. God, who created us, the people around us that we have duties and responsibilities to, both because of the kinds of beings they are, as well as because of our agreements and our promises and our interactions with them. Justice is this movement from prudence into, as the scholastics would say, giving the other their due. And that's what justice is the virtue of not just doing something out of sort of grinding duty, with our teeth clenched doing our duty, but again, growing in that virtue over time, that the righteousness of God, the rightness, the doing our duty, doing what is right, giving to others their due, giving to God his due glory, becomes our very desire, our very delight. And so we see this in many passages of Scripture. The description of the just man is one who doesn't just, again, do something out of a cold sense of duty, but a delight that he's grown into through the practice of the virtue of justice. So prudence immediately proceeds into justice. That's it. That's its main object, is being open to reality and recognizing, the duties that we have, the relationships that we have, and acting according to those relationships. And that's the virtue of justice. So then, proceeding from there, we have prudence proceeding into our duties, the right actions we need to take. So that's justice. And so, proceeding on from there, we have these two pillars, the pillar that is fortitude or courage, as it's sometimes called, and temperance. And they really are these pillars that guard prudence and justice, our ability to begin and remain prudence proceeding into our duties of justice. And they're pillars that protect us in two different situations we encounter. So in the case of fortitude or courage, as mortal beings, as beings that can be damaged, as beings that can die, as beings that can feel pain, we encounter things that instill fear in us because we're open to damage, we're open to attack. And whenever we encounter fear, we encounter intimidation, we encounter something that's difficult, challenging, then the virtue of courage is our decision, again, in prudence, proceeding from prudence, our decision to do the right thing that is hard, even though it's hard because it's right. And so in prudence, we recognize our duties in justice and we choose to do them. And when we encounter fear, when we encounter, a challenge that's intimidating, that scares us, that makes us want to back down or turn away from the path of justice, courage is this decision to do the right thing anyway. On the flip side, so within courage, we have this passion of fear. On the flip side, though, we have desires for things. We have desires that are, again, they're put in us by God for good things, for food and for drink and for intimacy and for desire for justice that would come out in a certain wrath or anger at evil. But all these passions have to be ordered by prudence. We have to choose the good and bring those passions in line with that good thing. Now, whenever those desires, those passions would pull us away from the prudent thing, whenever our desire from food would go overboard, or our desire for drink or for intimacy, our desire for justice now in the way I want it, and desire for peace and quiet in my household, any of those desires, when they would take us away from the simple demands of justice as we've identified in prudence, then temperance is that virtue of consciously turning those desires back and ordering them rightly. So, I mean, that kind of gives us this picture of the cardinal virtues. And again, like as I said from the beginning, the preeminence of prudence was a surprise to me, because that really does give you the key to this picture, where it's your reason open to reality, trying to make a right decision. That's really the key to this whole structure. And then we see that as we proceed to the level of emotion and passion, that again under the steering of prudence, the virtues of courage and of temperance are steering these passions rightly. So in face of fear or desire, we order our passions toward the good. And again, because these are virtues we're talking about, this is not something we do once, it's something we practice, and we grow stronger in over time. We grow stronger in the ability to be and remain prudent, to seek the truth and to act quickly and promptly on the good that we recognize. We grow in justice, where we do our duty and we delight in doing our duty. In fact, we dig deeper and deeper into the reality of who we are and who God is and who our neighbor is. And so the demands of justice, we feel them even more and more deeply as our life goes on. And we want to step up to even a higher response to those demands of justice as we go. And encourage, more and more so, we grow in this ability to step up to the things that scare us, the things that we would otherwise avoid. And in temperance, we grow in the ability to order these desires, to turn them where they ought to be, and thus to keep our heart open to being fully attached to what it ought to be, which is God.
And you're speaking as if there's a certain joy in growing in the virtues, right? Which makes complete sense. If these are what kind of, I often describe to my catechesis class at the parish when I'm trying to explain, there's the idea out there that the Catholic Church is full of rules that we have to follow, right? And as Catholics, we know. Catholics who are interested in digging deeper into our faith, we know these rules, so-called rules, things like the virtues. These exist for a reason. These are, I often describe them as kind of the operating instructions that God gave us, right? And of course, if these virtues are our operating instructions, then operating in that way will make us more joyful and draw us closer into Christ and make us operate more in the way that we were meant to, which is going to end up in maybe joy might be the wrong word, because joy might sound like we never will experience pain or suffering or loss. But, practicing the virtues, if that is how God intends us to live, is going to help us to live better, even when these things might come along that try to derail us. Does that make sense?
I think joy is the right word, because we make a distinction between mere happiness, mere temporary passing pleasure, and this joy that only God can give, that only can come about by our cooperating with God, either consciously in terms of his revelation in the faith, but I think sometimes even unconsciously in terms of the person who maybe doesn't know God yet, but begins to activate these cardinal virtues, who begins to be prudent, who begins to seek to do justice as best as they understand it, who begins to be courageous. Throughout all times and places and cultures, again, these go back to the Greeks, recognizing that this is just part of human nature. And as you said, so many things intersect in the cardinal virtues, because we're talking about the place where grace meets human nature. And prudence, again, at the helm of the cardinal virtues, really is this locus. It is where what is morally good meets with what is psychologically healthy, meets with what is the full human flourishing of our faculties, where that meets with the reality of things, where that meets with God's will. All that intersects in prudence. When you open yourself to reality and you ask, what ought I do right now? What's the prudent thing? You're also asking at the same time, what is reasonable? What is good? What is true? And perhaps most importantly, tying all that together, what is God's will for my life? When the Christian asks, God, what do you want of me? He's also asking, what is the prudent thing right now? And the thing is, again, the story we live in, the universe we live in, the reality we live in is that in prudence, we discover the intersection of all those things. What is true, what is God's will, really is the most reasonable thing. Really is the moral thing, really is the only thing that will bring us joy. Maybe not temporary happiness, but joy, meaning, fulfillment. All those coincide when the person chooses to activate their prudence and seek what is the prudent thing, what is right here. And so, again, in the cardinal virtues, we have this coming together of, certainly our faith and the do's and do nots, the ethical, moral view we receive from Scripture and from the faith. But that meets our actual human nature, our actual faculties, so our actual growth of our character, as well as our attempt day to day as Christians to be open to the movement of the Holy Spirit. All that intersects in the cardinal virtues. It gives us a language, a structure, a rubric, a hermeneutic to understand how all that fits together. And that's what was so electrifying to me, because that's what I was looking for back, again, as I described a couple of years ago. I wanted to understand how these things fit together. How did this knowledge that I came to know, how did that fit together with my desire to follow God, to receive his grace? How does that translate into living differently, changing my behavior, making myself more open to the theological virtues, making the path straight in my heart, so that I could be, more fully, living and loving Christ.
It's fascinating because we talk this way. We talk about living more like Christ and being more of a disciple of Christ, and we know that as Catholics, as Christians, we ought to look and act and be a different thing in the world than the world is. Mm-hmm. But then, and I know I want to circle around in a bit to some practical applications for these virtues, but it strikes me quite strongly, and this is why I reached out to you, in that message way back when, that cry for help, because there is no apparent framework for, okay, so here's what Jesus says about these different things, social justice issues, about how we should honor God, how we should worship, how we ought to order our priorities. But then, there isn't this apparent framework of how we should be actually living day to day, ordering our emotions and ordering our choices. And this is, I can see why this is electrifying for you, because this is the framework that I feel like is kind of the missing link. And like you said, the medievals had this figured out, and we've lost this along the way somewhere. But this is the ordering for how we are to live like Christ in the world, in that very practical sense.
And once you have the rubric, I encourage you, and go back and read some of your favorite books. Go back and read some of your favorite passages of Scripture. You'll find that the cardinal virtues are all throughout Scripture. The prudent man looks ahead, as it says in Proverbs. The just man, that's throughout Scripture. And throughout the New Testament, again, we have Christ challenging us, challenging the people of his day, but challenging us as well, that if our faith is merely an external thing, merely what we wear and what we do on the street corners and what we proclaim in front of other people, but in our hearts is death and sin and hatred, then we've missed something. We can look great on the outside, but if in our hearts we're motivated by fear or motivated by desire or motivated by anger, if that's what's moving us, then we are living wrongly. In Prudence, we recognize that it is my whole being needs to come into line with the demands of justice. I don't just love on the outside. In my heart, I have to order my desires toward that good thing. I have to stand up to those things that I'm afraid of. I have to address those aspects of my personality that scare me. That's all part of this. The cardinal virtues give us this picture, this structure for understanding how all that fits together, how the objective demands of the faith, the reality out there, touches my subjective experience. And that for it to be moral for me, I have to choose it. That's why, as Catholics, we have a rich ethical framework. For something to be a mortal sin, as we learn in our catechism, it has to objectively be wrong. It has to be grave matter in this objective external sense. But we also have to know it. That's not enough either. We also have to choose it. We have to, with our free will, fully choose to do that. That's what it takes for it to be a fully mortal sin. Well, on the flip side, for something to be a fully moral action, it can't just merely be an external, apparently good thing. I have to know it, and that's prudence. And I have to choose it. That's prudence proceeding into justice and the virtues. And so again, we take those cardinal virtues. We go back. You go back and read Scripture. Go back and read some of your favorite books. You'll recognize now that this gives us a description of how that knowledge kind of comes to root in our hearts in a way that we can activate, we can act on. We can try to more actively cooperate with God's grace in this information.
Well, it seems like there's an interesting flip side to these these virtues, right?
Yeah.
So maybe the natural inclination is to react a certain way to something, but no,
Yeah.
the virtues are going to call you back. Prudence, especially, will call you back to wait, stop, and think about this action, and don't just. And this is symptomatic of our culture, of my life. Certainly, I'll bring it back to myself over and over again. I'm reacting to things, versus stopping and thinking about that thing, taking a few seconds to avoid the hot take, and then using my reason, my God-given, God-guided reason, flowing from that grace that God has built into us, to try and temper my first inclination, and then perhaps make a better, more reasoned reaction, versus just that gut reaction, which often is not going to be flowing from a place of prudence or temperance.
Yeah. One of the many practical applications of having this structure in mind is the examination of your conscience. It allows a much more, I think, insightful and actionable examination that it allows you to make. So we recognize, again, in temperance, I can look back on my day and I can look at when are the times where I acted out of desire, not because I identified the good and I prudently chose it, but I reacted simply because my passion was driving me. It might have been a passion for some pleasure, some food or some drink or something like that. It might have been a passion and anger against injustice, but that still has to be moderated. It still has to be piloted by prudence. And so if I reacted in anger, but I wasn't in control of myself, I wasn't acting in prudence, then there's a fault there. There's a flaw there. There's a slight vice going on there. On the flip side, in courage, when I react in fear, and my prudence doesn't get in there and recognize the thing I'm fearing and make a good choice, I'm stepping aside too. In the realm of temperance, as I mentioned earlier, you can kind of see how many of the other virtues are sort of sub-virtues of these cardinal virtues. So obviously under temperance, we have things like sobriety. We have things like purity and chastity. We have moderation of anger. Anger is not a bad thing. It's a good passion. All of our passions are good, but they have to be ordered. They have to be tempered. If they're to be, and they have to be tempered by prudence. What's the good here? What's what I ought to be doing? And so again, they give us this exam, and we look at our desires, we look at our passions, we look at our fears, and we ask, and we look for ways where those were driving us rather than our prudence. And so it gives us this great way to look back at our day, look at our life, and recognize when we're acting out of passion rather than with our reason and our will.
So I'm thinking of courage, and I'm thinking of how courage, this is one of those things that, and you talked about earlier, the idea of the modern mind struggling with some of these ideas, because courage to many, to my mind in some senses, is almost a reckless abandonment of a lot of my own safety, of my own whatnot. I'm thinking of the man who sees a burning car on the side of the road and jumps out of his car and jumps into that car to save the person who's in that burning car. But then perhaps he is killed in that attempt to save somebody's life. But then maybe he's left his family and children in the car that he jumped out of to save the person in the other car. That to me maybe is getting at an example of where courage might need to be informed by the other virtues?
Yeah, because the virtues describe this meeting place of the objective and the subjective aspects of morality, we recognize that there are situations in which one person may be being virtuous, another person may be vicious in that same situation. For example, you have a person who, by temperament, they're not necessarily a confrontational person, but they recognize a situation in which they need to stand up and speak the truth and perhaps resist some evil. And that is a prudent act for them to do that, to be courageous in that way. On the other hand, you have someone who by temperament loves to fight, loves to argue, and they may look externally like they're being courageous, like they're being, a real courageous, soldier for the truth. But only that person can know for sure, but they may look inside themselves and recognize, I'm just intemperate when it comes to wrath, when it comes to my anger, my desire for justice now in my time and in my way. And they're seeking out fights, they're seeking out battles. But again, it's their passion that's at the helm, not prudence, not what has God called me to? What battle ought I be in? How ought I communicate this truth or fight this battle? And so again, it can look like, we can have two things that both look like courage, but in one person, it's courage, and another person, it's actually intemperance. It's actually a failure of the other cardinal virtue.
Yeah, that's a fantastic example, and I don't know why I'm thinking of this, but I'm thinking of felt banners, okay? And I'm thinking I'm thinking of the person that might just absolutely hate felt banners, right, in their church, and takes it upon themselves. This is not an example I've experienced, thank goodness, but takes it upon themselves to go, march up Sunday morning before Mass and just tear those felt banners off the wall or something. Mm-hmm. That might look courageous to somebody in the pew who also hates felt banners. Mm-hmm. But as you say, and I think I'm saying this correctly, I think if it's that person's passion, just they're spoiling for a fight. They don't like felt banners, and that's just how it's going to be. That doesn't seem to be a very virtuous act, even if everyone else who doesn't like felt banners might be applauding from the pews.
Yeah, definitely. I mean, that's again, it gives us this exam and this way of looking inward and saying, whatever it looks like to other people on the outside, what's going on in my heart? And again, throughout the New Testament, Christ talks about that, and the later writers, point back to the kind of life that Christ is calling to us is a true transformation, not just of our external actions, what we look like on the outside, but what's going on in our hearts. So another example here of kind of two approaches, and this is somewhere in Pieper's book, I don't remember exactly where, but he points out again another set of terms that the scholastics had were this distinction between studiositas and curiositas. And these are both connected to temperance in terms of our desire for knowledge. And studiositas, studiousness, studying, that's the root is there, would describe this temperate desire and pursuit of knowledge. I'm seeking knowledge. I'm studying in a way that my prudence is determined is my vocation, is what I ought to be doing in the right way, in the right time, in the right manner, and the right content. That is the studious person, the studiositas, as they would call it. But they contrasted that with curiositas, curiosity, as this vicious failing of temperance, where there's a desire for an inordinate desire for knowledge that's really not my business, that really doesn't pertain to my vocation. And my real reason for studying is because I just desire to study it. And the distinction is so useful because, again, in this information age, in this age of social media, in this age of headlines and clickbait and hot takes, we can see two people out in the media. And again, we can't know for sure what's in another person's heart. But I know in myself that I wrestle with this, that there are some times when I've prudently discerned that I need to go research this topic. And I go do that. Then this is the time, this is the place I'm going to research it. But most of the time these days, a lack of knowledge is not the issue in my life. There's not really stuff like I've got my duties in front of me. I know what I need to do. I'm just not doing it. But I desire to be on social media. I desire to spend my days clicking through headlines and chasing down rabbit holes and looking up conspiracy theories and watching the dumpster fires and watching people argue and getting angry with them. That is this curiosity that they describe, this inordinate, imprudent desire for knowledge that really is not what I ought to be focusing on. And so again, the looking at this contrast between studiositas and curiositas, we see how in temperance, again, governed by prudence, we have to ask, certainly I have a desire for knowledge. I have a desire to see, to study, to learn. But that too, like everything else in my life, like all my other passions, has to be ordered and subordinated to what God wants of me, what he has called me to do. And so I always have to double back and reassert prudence and say, what ought I be doing here? Should I be on Facebook while I'm at work and looking at the latest dumpster fire news articles that are coming out of, either the secular world or the church world? Most of the time, if I ask myself that honestly, I would say, no, that is not what God is calling me to do right now. For many obvious reasons.
Yeah, it's that. And this comes back around to that hot take culture, right? The idea that, and this is why I originally thought of you and the virtues and all of that, because it seems to me that there's just so many different hot takes on everything, everything coming out in the secular world, and this is something that I don't know that it should spill over into our Catholic and Christian orbits, this hot take, because it seems to me that if I'm not taking the time to slow down and reflect on something and discern this, turn this thing around in my hands and look at it from all the different angles and really be prudent in my examination of this thing and this topic and this information, maybe I shouldn't be putting my opinion out there, in this initial kind of flash of whatever the first thing that comes off the top of my head. Maybe I should exercise some prudence and temperance first.
Yeah. Well, I think it'd be helpful. Let's just start back at the beginning in terms of, so going back to where you started here, in terms of the situation with the synod or any situation in civil society or ecclesial society where we have drama, we have intrigue, starting with prudence and proceeding into the cardinal virtues, we can perform this analysis on ourselves. Now we can never perfectly perform it on somebody else, because we can only see the external aspects of their actions. We can only infer as to the state of their soul, the state of their virtue or vice, whatever. But when we recognize that in ourselves, we can at least see the dangers that others may or may not be putting themselves in. So beginning with prudence, again, we do realize that as we make the choice to be prudent, to be awake, to be intentional, to be open to reality, I'm open to the reality of the world that I live in, and that world includes good and bad things. It involves movements and changes and events, and to be aware of those things is just part of prudence, certainly. But then we proceed into justice, and one of the aspects of justice is not just doing my duty, but ordering my duties, recognizing that there's a hierarchy, a higher and lower in terms of the duties that I have. My first duty is to my Creator, to thank Him, to praise Him, to serve Him, to obey Him. That is the first order of justice comes before anything else. But then of course, like you and I, Keith, we're married men, we're parents. And that is a fundamental vocation that God has given to us that really comes before a lot else in our lives. I can't make the choice to go out and just, hop on a boat and become a missionary, because God has already spoken from the heavens and told me, you are to take care of your wife, Teresa, and your kids. And I know that because I've got the ring on my finger to prove it. I don't have to discern that anymore. That aspect of justice, that demand, is high on that priority list. And it has to be respected as such. And so, again, proceeding down from that list, yes, I have my job, I have my bills to pay, I have promises I've made, I have responsibilities. And so then again, the question applied to this issue is, where does my involvement in an issue like this, whether it's a political, question or, an election, or whether it's some controversy in the church, what are the demands of justice on me in regards to that issue? And again, there's a lot of discernment that needs to go on there. If a family member of mine is disturbed by it, then there's maybe an element of justice in addressing that. But all that stuff aside, is there a demand on justice on me to be involved in social media, to be spending my days researching and worrying and fussing over this? Where does my involvement, my attempt to do something about those issues, where does it fall in the scale of justice, in the priority list of my life? And that's something everyone has to discern for themselves, but it's at least very clear to me that it's down there quite a bit. And most of the time, I'm not fulfilling those higher order responsibilities nearly to the degree I ought to be. And at the same time, I'm desiring to go get involved in social media and argue with my Facebook contacts and all that kind of stuff, reading the news articles. It's not that there may not be a time and place, a just time and place, a prudent time and place for some of that research, for some of that information. But most of the time when I'm desiring it, I'm desiring something that would be unjust. I'm at work and I'm desiring to read the news articles, the dumpster fires. I'm at home when I should be paying attention to my wife and kids, and I'd rather be on Facebook to seeing what the latest gossip is. So right there, again, in justice, we recognize that we have to order these responsibilities. We have to recognize where they fall. I may have some duty. You're very gracious to bring me on here, Keith, but I am not a scholar. I'm not a communicator. I don't have a public duty to this. I have maybe a duty within my family and friends to speak on it well if it comes up. But for the most part, that duty falls down below a lot of other much more important and fundamental things.
Well, it's interesting that you, as you're saying that, I'm thinking of a debate I'm currently engaged in with a certain person, a fellow on Twitter and on YouTube, based on just a silly little video that I saw that misrepresented some Catholic teaching, and I thought, I've got to respond to this.
Someone's wrong on the internet, Keith.
Oh, get him. Believe it or not, and I was thinking of this show. I was thinking of talking to you, and I'm thinking, what's the prudent thing to do? But when it comes down to it, so many of these responses are governed by our passions. I mean, yes. I have a passion for not necessarily debate, but for I love my Catholic faith, and I love the theology and the discussion and then the apologetics, and I love this stuff. And so I have a passion for this. I'd love to get involved in these discussions, but is that a prudent thing to do? Like, in the scheme of things, if I'm going to be arguing on Twitter or Facebook all night while my children are languishing, out in the foyer waiting for their meal or something, that's clearly my priorities are ordered wrong. I'm responding to my passion for loving to do something, but that should be tempered by the other virtues.
And again, we have to recognize some really profound implications here. Whenever I depart from prudence and I simply act out of passion, that's a however slight, that is a moral failure. When I simply react in anger, or I eat a whole bag of chips just because I want to, not because I decided that that's the healthy thing to do, but just because I want to, Whenever I act simply out of my passion, there's a slight moral failure that has occurred there. Now, another principle we know in Catholic theology, Catholic ethics, is that the end never justifies the means. So where this comes to bear is that whenever I have a desire, I may have a desire, a passion for something good. And Keith, you're talking about your passion for the Catholic faith, your passion for truth, your passion for helping that poor soul who is in error not be in error anymore. But in our passion, we very quickly rush to to pursue a good end through evil means, through a moral failure. When I depart from prudence, when I should be paying attention to my kids or doing my work or something else, if I were really being prudent, I would recognize there was something else I'm supposed to be doing. But when I depart from that, because in my passion, I want to teach this person a lesson, or I want to correct this error, or I want to right this wrong, I have made a slight moral failure, however slight, for the sake of some good. I've pursued a good thing through not perfect means. And the thing is, it may seem like we're splitting hairs here. It may seem like that's a very slight moral failure, but the reality is God only has one will for my life. Right now, he has one thing that is prudent for you, Keith, to do right now. He has one thing right now that is prudent for me to do. And it is my duty to simply be open to that and to try to recognize that and to try to do that. And if at any moment I'm trying to do God's will, I'm trying to do the prudent thing, then God's grace is there with me, helping me, guiding me. and perhaps maybe reorienting me if I had some bad information or whatever. But if I'm not, for any reason, for fear, for desire, for rebelliousness, if I'm not trying sincerely to do God's will, I'm stepping off that path of prudence. I'm stepping out of God's will. I'm trying to do perhaps some good, but through some other means than obedience to God. And so again, in the Cardinal Virtues, we have this intersection between God's will and the moral life and ethical calculation. It's all there.
I'm just thinking because, and you said this too. I mean, my passion for the Catholic faith, my love of my brother, who I'd like to explain this to, in the hopes that they understand the Catholic Church a bit better, because I think the Catholic Church is important to understand better. Yeah. Especially for our separated brethren, who's so close to the truth. But here's one little bit. But that one little bit, it's often my ego, my passion that's driving me to provide that information. It's not so it's a right act, but it's not filtered through the right filter. Like it's not necessarily. It could look good from the outside. I could appear to be very zealous and very holy and pious on Twitter to correct this person and to be teaching and instructing and look at this virtuous Catholic person. But if this is not filtered through, if this is at the neglect of other things that should be taking priority in my life because the virtues are letting me know that, or are helping me to frame that, then this is not a virtuous act, no matter how it might appear. And I love what you say, and you've said this over and over again, that we can't know other people's perspective. I can't necessarily tell you that you aren't acting according to the Cardinal Virtues any more than you can tell me. I mean, some acts are obviously outside of virtuous acts, but this is a very internal thing between my own working of the Holy Spirit in my heart and my mind and my soul, and my Creator, right?
Yeah. I mean, I could be. Again, externally, I can be feeding the poor. I can be caring for the sick. I can be doing all kinds of corporal works of mercy on the outside. But inside, why am I doing it? Maybe I'm doing it because I desire to be seen, desire to be recognized, desire to be applauded. So there's always both the external aspect as well as the internal aspect. And it's only if internally we've recognized a good act that God's calling us to, a good, the prudent thing in front of us, and we're recognizing it and we're choosing it, then it is a moral act. It is a good that we have done. Cooperating with God's grace, we've done that good thing, and we've grown in virtue. But there's again, as you said, there's that external aspect of it, but there's also what's going on in our hearts.
That's very well said, and I think so important to underscore, because what got all this started for me were so many of these opinions and perspectives, and then these outward acts like throwing these statues into the river, and so much of this, it seemed to be lacking in Christian virtue on many sides, and there's lots of examples of this in all corners of the church. I mean, we have equally have people speaking out about things that seem very contrary to church teaching as has been taught for the last 2,000 years. Yeah. And that too seems like, well, maybe we need to exercise some prudence here in how we say things and how we approach things and how we encourage others to act out and do things. But I mean, ultimately, and this is important to underscore, is I am in no position to say, hey, that, you aren't being virtuous in this act because clearly you aren't demonstrating prudence, because I can't necessarily know everything going on in that person's mind or soul or the relationship with Christ. But what we can do, and what I'm hoping to do with this discussion, is to encourage people to consider that for themselves and encourage them to begin to exercise these virtues, as you said so well, to begin to wake up in life and not simply be going through an autopilot and reacting to things.
Right. Yeah, we can't know another person's internal state. We can't know their relationship with God. We can't know the inner subjective aspect of their moral life. Now, we can look at the external aspect. We can see the words that they say and the actions that they do externally. And if there are errors there, we can correct them, and there is a spiritual duty to correct them. Now, but there's a couple issues here. One of them is that, so certainly we have a duty to speak truth and to correct error where we see it. I think one application of the cardinal virtues, though, in a situation like this, in a controversy in civil society or in ecclesial society, is that if we are honest with ourselves, do we have knowledge about that which we would very easily get on social media and speak of? The scholastics, the medievals, Aquinas would define knowledge as justified true belief. So there's two parts to that. It has to be true belief. It has to, something you believe has to, it turns out, actually be true. Yes. But you also have to be justified in believing it. If you believe something and it turns out that it was true, but you weren't justified, that is, you didn't actually have evidence, you didn't actually have a good reason to believe it. There was no probability, there was no firsthand data. You didn't actually have a just, that there's that word, a just reason, a justified reason to believe something. Even if it turns out to be true, you were acting in an unjustified way. You acted immorally. If you believe something, even if it turns out to be true, but if you chose to believe it in a way that was disproportionate to the actual justification you had to believe such a thing, you've acted wrongly. You've acted imprudently. And so again, we apply this to our relationship with the media. We read headlines all the time, and we believe them or disbelieve them. Why, Keith? Because we have evidence? Because we've tracked down the sources? Because we've talked to the people involved? No. Because our passions either want to believe or disbelieve a given headline. And so our passions move us, and then we rationalize why we should act a certain way. But if we're honest with ourselves, if we asked prudently, what knowledge do I have here? Do I really know what's going on here? 98% of the time we just don't when it comes to stuff that's going on in the media. When it comes to stuff that's going on in the Amazon Synod across the world. There may be bishops there may be cardinals there may be priests there that know what's going on, and we pray for them, and we that they are speaking the truth and standing up for what needs to be stood up for. But I don't know, sitting in here in Perrysburg, Ohio, in my house, looking at the headlines that come through social media. And so whenever with that level of belief, with that knowledge it's not knowledge. I may believe X, Y, or Z, but I'm not justified. I don't have the justification that would make it proper for me to then speak authoritatively on it, to disagree with someone else on the facts in a way that is disproportionate to the justification I have for my belief. I don't have the evidence. I just want to believe a certain thing. I just want to interpret a headline a certain way, but I don't actually have the justification for that. And again, take this to a much wider sphere. This is endemic in our society, in our relationship to the media and our relationship to information. We believe so much that we have so little justification for believing. Every new political story that comes through our newsfeed, every new nutrition science, opinion that comes out of the science world, we read a headline and we believe it because we want to, or we disbelieve it because we want to. Not because we have justified knowledge, justified belief in that thing. And so, again, if we were really being prudent, if we were really being just here, we would stand back and recognize I shouldn't be acting on something that's not knowledge. So I shouldn't be acting on unjustified belief. And so whenever again, this is a great thing that we keep in mind, Keith, when we talk to people of other opinions, other belief systems, when we're doing apologetics, that when someone asks us a question about something we don't actually know, the wrong answer is to barrel ahead and just say, well, you're just wrong because. No, it's to say, that's a really good point. I don't know the answer to that question. I'm going to research that and get back to you. That's the prudent thing to do. When someone gives you an argument you can't answer, the prudent thing to do is say, that's a good argument. I need to think about that a bit. I don't know the answer to that question. Maybe you've got a good point there. And so the cardinal virtues here give us this extremely challenging the cardinal virtues give us this extreme challenge to our relationship with the media, our relationship with the data that comes to the media that we have strong feelings about, but we don't actually have knowledge about. And we have to temper our desire to act on that knowledge when it's not knowledge. It's unjustified beliefs that we have. And so when we're getting into arguments, when we're chastising people, when we're gossiping about people, when we're tearing people down, when we're drawing conclusions about headlines that we don't have firsthand, we don't have secondhand, we don't have third or fourth or fifth or sixth or seventh hand knowledge about, we're doing wrongly. This is not to say that we don't discuss these things. This is not to say that we don't, again, prudently have situations where we need to seek out more truth, but we always have to be cognizant of what justification do I actually have to believe on this? And are my actions, are my words to other people, are my claims, are my arguments proportionate to the justification I have? Am I acting rightly in accord with the knowledge I actually have? Because if I'm not acting prudently, I'm not acting morally. And if I'm not acting morally, I'm stepping out of God's will. I can't expect good to come out of this if I am not trying to cooperate with God's will. The only option is prudence. The only option is to try to act rightly in accord to what I actually know.
And that's where you just drop the bike and walk away. Well, that's really, really well said. And I think that's a great exclamation point for this discussion. Where would you want to point people to? I mean, you've talked about this fantastic book by Josef Pieper. You want to give them the title for that, and then maybe where else they could go to learn more about this, or learn more about you or what you do in your day job, other than not checking Facebook.
In the order that you put them, I would definitely recommend Josef Pieper's The Cardinal Virtues, the Four Cardinal Virtues is what it's called, as well as his book, the collection of his treatises on the theological virtues, faith, hope, and love. Reading those together, and they're slow reads, but they're well worth the time. I think a more lightweight book that does a pretty good job of this too is called, I think it's Unearthing Your 10 Talents or Discovering Your 10 Talents. And I think the author is Kevin Vost, and that's about the virtues as well. And it was a pretty good explanation of them. And so, and then again, what I've found really valuable is discovering the knowledge of the scholastics, the medievals on this science of virtue and vice. And once I have that in my mind, this hermeneutic, then returning to some of my favorite books, like I've been rereading Screwtape Letters by C.S. Lewis. And with this structure in my mind, recognizing so much more practical applicability in understanding what's going on in myself, or even going back to the scripture and seeing where it's talking about prudence, seeing where it's talking about justice, seeing where the New Testament is contrasting the inner life and the external life. That, I think, would be a real fruitful thing for someone to do. And then using the cardinal virtues as a sort of examine, looking at my, asking myself, did I try to act prudently today? Asking myself in the moment when I have a difficult decision, what is the prudent thing? So again, those are good places to start with there. In terms of myself, I work for the Coming Home Network. I'm the director there, and we are a network of mostly Christians who come from other Protestant traditions, other non-Catholic traditions, who've come home to the Catholic Church, and we help others who are thinking about making that same journey. And you can visit our website at chnetwork.org.
That's fantastic. Hey, thank you so much for being on the show. This was, I think, a great discussion. I know I have learned a lot. I feel guilty for eating half a bag of chocolate chip cookies before the interview. Obviously was not demonstrating temperance, but I think I'll get over it. I need to do a bit of exercising, though. Thank you so much, JonMarc. God bless you. God bless your family. And God bless the fantastic work you are doing for the church. Thank you so much for being here.
Thank you, Keith.
Thank you for listening to this episode of The Cordial Catholic. I hope you enjoyed that interview. Hopefully it was exciting, encouraging. Hopefully it's going to help you to draw closer to Christ, to who we're all intended to be more like. Iron sharpens iron, and hopefully that was an encouraging and edifying conversation to listen to. Check out the show notes for this show in your podcasting app wherever you are listening, or at thecordialcatholic.com. Send feedback to cordialcatholic@gmail.com. I love hearing from you. I'm at Cordial Catholic on Twitter, The Cordial Catholic on Facebook. Please subscribe to or follow this podcast wherever you find it if you can. Leave ratings and reviews. Those are very precious, very important for pushing this podcast out to new people, and I really appreciate all of your reviews. If you want to support this podcast, any small donation, even $1 or $2 a month, goes a long way into helping me to keep this thing sustainable. Any financial contribution helps me to devote more time to this show, and that helps me to grow the mission of evangelization that underpins this whole thing. It's at patreon.com/cordialcatholic. I thank you for that. Thank you to my fantastic sponsors who are already supporting this show. You guys are the best. You all have my prayers, my fasting, my thoughts, my deepest thanks as well. Please do pray for me. Pray for this show. Pray for our listeners. I've had great feedback. It's growing. And thank you so much, guys. Talk to you again next week. God bless.